Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. I call the Space Court Foundation video series to order. Welcome. My name is Chris Hearsey, and I am the co-founder and chair of the board of directors for the Space Court Foundation. Thank you for joining us today to continue our video series on the Artemis Accords and the Future of Space Governance, Volume 2. The Space Court Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit corporation that promotes and supports space law and policy education and the rule of law. The Space Court Foundation produces educational materials and scholarship through the administration of two major projects, Stellar Decisis and the Space Court Law Library. The Foundation engages in partnerships and collaborations that help grow greater awareness of space law and how disputes in space may be resolved as humans venture further from the Earth in the not too distant future. For more information about our mission, programming, and internship program, we ask that you visit our website at spacecourtfoundation.org. Before we begin today, I'd like to make a few announcements. First, tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of the founding of the Space Court Foundation, and we have made amazing progress. This progress could not have been achieved without our talented team. I want to thank board members, officers, volunteers, interns, and everyone that has participated in all of our panels and all of our video series for their hard work and dedication to the foundation in one form or another. We have put together an excellent team of young professionals dedicated to space law education and the rule of law. Their help has made our work at the foundation a major success. Next, I'm excited to announce our first 3 partner organizations: the Space, Cyber, and Telecommunications Program at the Nebraska College of Law, the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University, and the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. We are so honored to be working with these distinguished institutions. We have worked to put together an innovative program that gives students opportunities to conduct research and expand their knowledge and scholarship in space law. We look forward to announcing new partnerships in the coming months. Finally, I'd like to thank our supporters and viewers for joining us today in our follow-on program on the Artemis Accords and the Future of Space Governance, Volume 2. If you like our programming, I invite you to check out the Space Court Foundation's YouTube channel, which you can link to from our website. We have produced to date almost 10 hours of content, and we will be bringing you more every month on important topics relating to the rules that govern space activities. Please remember to subscribe and follow us on social media for the latest updates. Once again, our moderator is Daniel Porras. Daniel serves as the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at the Secure World Foundation. Previously, Daniel has served as the Space Security Fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, where he focused on political and legal issues surrounding space security. He was the resident technical expert for multiple UN bodies working on space security issues, including the group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And recently, Daniel has been elected to the board of directors for the Space Court Foundation and has been an invaluable supporter of the foundation from the beginning. So thank you again, Daniel. Thank you for your work. And thank you for putting this excellent program together. I turn the program over to you.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and many thanks also to everyone that's helped to make this series of videos a success. And by the way, I don't know if anybody else just watched Cassandra walk back and forth, but it looked like she was like stepping off into the galaxy. It was quite cool.
Yeah, I mean, she disappeared into space, really, you know, it was fantastic. I want to do that too.
Yeah, I want to learn how to do that cool, like walk off the Milky Way. But so we're really excited to have this follow-on episode today from the previous video that we did on the Artemis Accords. And we're really delighted that we've got Mike Gold back to talk to us again about the updates and all the exciting things that have been taking place. So we're going to let Mike talk to us for a little bit about these new announcements related to the Artemis Accords. And then we've got some really exciting experts who are going to have a discussion and kind of go over what we think are some of the implications for international space law and, of course, for the future of space activities. So let me introduce the great Mike Gold, who is currently serving as the Acting Associate Administrator at NASA's Office of International and Interagency Relations. I think we've all seen him quite a lot in the last couple of weeks and months, as he's been, really doing a fantastic campaign to promote the Artemis Accords and all the wonderful things that NASA is trying to do. I will go ahead and say right now that I am NASA fan #1, so it's great to have somebody from the agency here to talk to us. I also want to remind everybody that in a prior life, Mike also, he was the vice president of civil space at Maxar Technologies, and he was also working at Bigelow Airspace and is responsible for putting an inflatable habitat on the International Space Station, along with Chris, who was working with him back then. So Mike, we're really delighted to have you back, and we can't wait to hear about all the cool things that y'all are doing over at NASA.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Appreciate the kind invitation to return. Appreciate what you and Chris have done. And I hope this is one of the few times the sequel will be even better than the original, because now we've got text, actual text for people. I'm so excited that I see Guoyo on my screen. Like, Guoyo, you can only imagine how difficult it was for me talking about this stuff without being able to share the text. So now that the text is free and loose, just so excited to be able to go over what we're actually doing for once. So thank you all at the Space Court Foundation and everyone who's participating in this panel. And let me apologize in advance for everyone who has heard me give this presentation before. I feel like this could be Rocky Horror Picture Show where everyone can just sing along with the principles of the Accords, but I do think it's worthwhile just to level set, and for anyone who's joining us for the first time, what the Accords are, probably as importantly what the Accords aren't as well, and to review the principles of the Accords, and again, really looking forward to having a dialogue. So if we could bring up the slides, I would be grateful, and we can even go right to the first slide about the Artemis Accords. And they really begin with the Artemis program, which, as I'm sure all of you know, is our effort at NASA to put the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024. A dynamic new program requires a dynamic new legal framework, although let me put a caveat when we say new, that with the Artemis program, we're going to be conducting exciting activities on the surface of the moon and on cislunar space to look at new discoveries and awe-inspiring science. Again, I just like to reference, as the administrator says, that we used to think the moon was bone dry back in the day, and now we discover vast quantities of water ice, and I guarantee that the moon has yet to reveal many of her secrets. We're just at the beginning of this amazing human journey for the US and all the other countries of the world, so an exciting time. And what the Artemis Accords are is the US really taking its obligations to existing multilateral agreements like the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, the Rescue of Astronauts, as well as a few other norms of behavior that we've always operated with seriously. In as much as we said, look, for any country that's going to be an entity that's contributing and working with us on Artemis, we want them to abide by the existing multilateral agreements. And that's primarily what the Accords are, reinforcing and implementing aspects of the Outer Space Treaty, Registration Convention, etc. And I think that's very different than what some misperceptions can be about, oh, this is a replacement for the Outer Space Treaty or twisting the Outer Space Treaty, etc. That, again, you all can decide how successful or not we've been, but the idea was to just to highlight aspects of the OST and say that we've got these good rules, these good principles on the books. Let's all follow them as we go forward to the moon and then eventually on to Mars. And very briefly, what are those principles? So let's just spin through the greatest hits of the Artemis Accords quickly here, and beginning with peaceful purposes. And let me say to Guoyo and our other panelists, how helpful, even though no one got to see the text of the Accords, Guoyo's Peace and Space review, and even the comments from the last Space Corps Foundation, just know we're listening, and that, it was good even to get that feedback from folks who hadn't seen the Accords. And certainly when it comes to peaceful purposes, and if we go to the next slide, peaceful purposes, I don't know if I'm just getting a lag or not. There we go. that again, we're just emphasizing what's in the Outer Space Treaty, that if anyone wants to join us at a threshold level, that it should be a peaceful operation. Again, like the Outer Space Treaty, these are principles, so general guidelines. We just wanted to reinforce that, again, our goal is peaceful operations, and our ultimate objective with the Accords, as I mentioned before, is to avoid conflict by following the multilateral agreements that we've got on the books today. Next slide, please. Then we come to transparency. As I mentioned before, we're very transparent at NASA. You get to see all of the sausage making being made in Congress as well. And transparency is so important to avoiding conflict, that so many of our terrestrial conflicts are based on misperceptions, lack of communication, and confusion, which is why we're asking any country who joins the Artemis Accords to just be public about what their plans are, what their policies are, and try to operate in a transparent manner. And again, we already do this, many other nations do as well. Next slide, please. Then we come to interoperability. And this is not in the Outer Space Treaty, but is a goal that we all wanted to strive towards. And here simply, we just believe that the more interoperable systems are, the better it's going to be for commercial activities, that interoperable systems that are compatible, that will create a great environment for private sector investment and development, and for all government activities, that to the extent that all of our hardware can talk to each other, whether it's from the US or any other nation, it will just allow for the entire world to function in greater harmony. And let me be clear again, this is just a principle. This isn't intended to be draconian in any way. It's really aspirational, because I know getting to fully interoperable systems may be challenging, but a good topic for you and COPUOS and others to take upon themselves in international forum, groups like Confers and industry, to just try and move forward to interoperability as best that we can. And going on to the next slide, which is emergency assistance, you see where interoperability can be important. That again, we're going to ask any country that joins the Artemis program, hey, we think it's important for you to reinforce your compliance with the agreement on the rescue of astronauts, and rendering assistance to astronauts in distress is just the cornerstone of any responsible civil space program. And to the extent that systems are interoperable, that will allow for safer, more effective, more expeditious, and ultimately more successful emergency assistance. So it's an example of why we think interoperability is a good thing to strive for. Although, again, with any of these principles or principles in general, you can always take things to extremes, which we want to avoid. Even with interoperability, you can see where that could be challenging for innovation. So it's always important to strike a balance relative to what we want to achieve. And again, none of these principles are meant to go to these extreme areas, that they'll be implemented in a common sense fashion, which is why we proceeded with principles rather than being more prescriptive. Next slide, please. Registration of space objects, again, another good example of the Accords simply reinforcing the importance of the Registration Convention, that registration is the foundation that everything else is built upon. We can't get to issues of liability. We can't deconflict activities properly if we're not following registration. So not only our partners, but the US with the Artemis Accords is just reaffirming and reinforcing the importance of the Registration Convention. And certainly if there's any partner that wants to join the US in the Artemis program and they're not a member of the Registration Convention, we're urging them to become a member with alacrity. Next slide, please. Release of scientific data. Again, something that isn't explicitly in the Outer Space Treaty, but is, we think, very much in the spirit of the treaty. It is a norm of behavior that NASA has always operated with, that we believe it's very important for NASA and other space agencies to commit to the timely, full, and open sharing of scientific data that allows the whole world to go with us on this journey. And as long as you've got an internet connection, you can get that data, you can be a part of the mission, and you can learn from the incredible advances that we hope to make with this new journey of discovery. So just as NASA's always done, we're going to publicly release all scientific data. And for countries that join us in Artemis, we're going to ask them to do so as well, because we think it's important not just for us, but for the world. Next slide, please. Protecting heritage sites. Again, we could have written a dozen pages relative to protecting heritage. And for Guoyo and Dan, others, who participate in the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group, there is more, I think, written on these topics. And again, the Artemis Accords are meant to inspire further conversations. The Accords are a beginning, not an ending. So we look forward to sitting down with our colleagues internationally at groups like the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses for Outer Space and groups like The Hague and other international forums to talk about how we put meat on the bones and really implement something like protecting heritage. As you've seen with the text of the Accords, it's relatively light, really just proceeding with the simple contention that we want to try and protect our heritage, just like we do here on Earth, where we honor our historic sites, our historic artifacts. We need to do the same on the moon. And as I always like to point out, while this is a picture of human space flight, we also need to protect robotic heritage sites, whether that's a rover or a lander. So just generally, this is something that we need to accomplish. And again, is a good example where it would be terrific to have more of a global conversation on this topic to add details, that the Accords are meant to be, again, principles. These are the guidelines that we're going to implement as we go forward with the Artemis program. And we look forward to taking our experiences on something like space heritage to say, well, we avoided a space heritage site by 50 meters, and then sharing that with the international community as the international community develops more rules relative to how we might implement something like this. Next slide, please. Space resources. And again, here I think it's important to distinguish what's in the Artemis Accords from the executive order and from other actions that we're taking at NASA, such as the commercial purchase of space resources, because the Artemis Accords are very much a common ground document. That with the Artemis Accords, we were sitting down with the other 7 partner nations and not only saying what is it that we all can agree upon, but what do we think the world can agree upon? What do we think that potential future partners and other nations, what can everyone agree to? And where we got with space resources is, again, the common sense contention that you can extract and utilize resources, and that such activities should be conducted under the auspices of the Outer Space Treaty, specifically Articles 2, 6, and 11, but everything in the Outer Space Treaty. And as you look at the initial countries that signed the Accords, you'll note that Australia was a part of it. And Australia, shall we say, has very different views than the US on the Moon Agreement. But this is where you see the broad and inclusive aspect of the Artemis Accords, that whether you're a country like the US that wants to go in a very different direction than the Moon Agreement, or one that's even a signatory like Australia, it's common ground. We're trying to unite nations together, and that's an example where even if you're a Moon Agreement signatory, we were looking to see what can we all agree to. And again, it's the simple contention that you can extract and you can utilize, and that it should be done underneath the auspices of the Outer Space Treaty. So, a modest contention, but we think an important one. Next slide, please. Deconfliction of activities. Again, this is one where I'd like to avoid any misperceptions, because I think that sometimes this aspect of the Accords can open up that conversation. Why I'm so grateful to have this forum and be able to speak to the panelists and everyone else on this call. So this aspect of the Accords is a very good example of where we're trying to implement the obligations of the Outer Space Treaty, particularly preventing harmful interference. And the language of the safety zones and the concept even of safety zones goes back to my experience, and I was in the private sector at the time, with the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group. The names rolls off the tongue. Again, we got to work on an acronym or something good for that. But with the Hague, we were talking about safety zones. And what we do in the Accords with safety zones, and certainly, if not exact language from The Hague, it was inspired by what we were doing at The Hague, which both Guoyo and I were a part of, and really appreciated Guoyo's contributions, as well as everyone else around the table, and from our European colleagues and Japanese colleagues. And what was great to see so many of our friends from industry, which I was at the time, sitting down with government, that I was across the table wearing a private sector badge, from government officials from Mexico, for example, and United Arab Emirates. So really great opportunity to synthesize both public and private sector actors. And where we got with the Artemis Accords is, again, a common ground document with safety zones, is it's simply the area where you might create harmful interference, and it actually creates an obligation on the party that is operating on the moon or wherever you might be in cislunar space to notify the United Nations as well as publicly in terms of where you are and what you're doing. This gets back to the transparency principle and overall theme of the Artemis Accords, that transparency is really the spine that you see in many of these principles, including deconfliction of activities. So you need to notify and then simply coordinate for anyone who enters the area where there might be harmful interference between the two parties. We use the word coordinate in the Outer Space Treaty. It actually says consult. To quote Shakespeare, rose by any other name, that the obligations for the safety zone are to notify and to coordinate. And here I think it's very important to understand what the Artemis Accords aren't, which is in any way, shape, or form a stay out zone or an exclusionary zone or anything that would hamper the free access on a celestial body, which is required by the Outer Space Treaty. And for anyone who looks at the text of the Accords, we wanted to emphasize that point, which is why we actually explicitly reference the fact that via Article 1, nothing in a safety zone is intended to or would deny free access as required by the Outer Space Treaty. It's simply a requirement to notify and again to coordinate to avoid harmful interference, which are existing obligations underneath the Outer Space Treaty. Next slide, please. Orbital debris. Needless to say, this is a challenge here on Earth. And in so many ways, we want to do better in space than we have on Earth. And this is an example of it, that debris has been a growing problem here. And for any country that joins us with the Artemis Accords, we're going to ask those partners and their operations to have a plan for mitigation of orbital debris and also the efficient and safe passivation and disposal of spacecraft at the end of their mission. So we think, again, a pretty common sense proposition that we're hoping, again, that none of these things would be controversial. Going on to the next slide, please. And so as you know, there were 7 countries that we were really proud to have join us on this first tranche of the Artemis Accords. And I think it's very important to understand why these were the first set of countries, because again, it goes to what the Artemis Accords are and what they aren't. So the reason that it was these nations is because, again, the Artemis Accords are where NASA wanted to leverage the popularity of the Artemis program, because I think we can all agree going back to the moon is the right first step along the road to Mars. That beware of false dichotomies, where we had a moon-Mars debate, and I like to be able to talk about that in the past tense, because there was a day where people would argue that every dollar you spend on Mars is a dollar that you're not spending on the moon, or vice versa. And what we're really trying to do with the Artemis program and the Accords in particular is bring people together, whether that's Moon Mars, whether that's Democrats and Republicans, whether that's people of different nations. Because of that popularity of the moon mission, the administrator wanted to leverage this as an opportunity to gain for countries that already are or want to participate in the Artemis program to agree to these common sense principles, these norms of behavior, all based on multilateral agreements or norms of behavior that we've always implemented at NASA, like the public release of scientific data, so that we could create a safe, peaceful, and prosperous future. So all of the nations that initially signed on were prioritized because they're all nations that we're working with or will soon be working with on the Artemis program. The caveat that we had is that for anyone who's been through an international negotiation, it is extremely difficult developing text with a very large group, which is why it was good to begin by prioritizing the partners who are already or will soon be contributing to Artemis. We developed text in cooperation with everyone, and now we can go out with the text to any other country that wants to join Artemis. And again, while this is 4 countries that are contributing to the Artemis program, it was still very important for us to be as inclusive as possible with the text, that particularly our partners at UAE and elsewhere, kept emphasizing, for those who aren't at the table, how do we write something that the entire world can embrace? And that's what we were trying to do with the Accords, to create a document that even for those that wouldn't sign, that it would be a positive force in international discussions at COPUOS or elsewhere for reinforcing and again implementing the values of the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, etc. That's what we're trying to do, so that even if you're not a signatory to the Accords, that we hope that there aren't any of these principles that anyone could disagree with, and that they'll help inform future dialogues where ourselves and other nations can come to UN COPUOS and other international forums and discuss the experience that we gained to go further in terms of all of these issues, to add meat to the bones and details based on our experience. I believe that experience is critical to good policy, that you can only get to good policy with good experience, which is why, again, we use principles and stay at the high level, because we don't have that experience yet. But as we do, we'll be moving forward. I also just want to address multilateral versus bilateral. So the principles of the Accords we developed with our partners, those principles and the text belong as much to them as they do to us. That I swear, again, the Japanese, I think, speak better English than we do, that it was amazing what our partners would catch and come back to us. And it was terrific to get such a diverse amount of views from such a diverse amount of countries and cultures coming together to draft this text, again, with an eye towards not only ourselves, but everyone else. And while we're all agreeing to the principles, and that any country that contributes to Artemis will have to agree to the principles, the actual contributions will be done on a bilateral basis, which has always been the case with NASA programs, or at least most of our programs. And that's important because it allows us to be broader in terms of the countries that will join. It's challenging for something like the International Space Station and its legal framework, the intergovernmental agreement, for other nations to join in, at least in terms of being a part of that document, because of the nature of that agreement. With these bilateral agreements that we can do for contributions to Artemis, it allows not only large substantive contributions, but no matter how modest, you can still be a part of the Artemis program. And that could be as little as a CubeSat or even university students interpreting data. And that's so important because we want to assemble the broadest and most diverse coalition in the history of human spaceflight to support Artemis. So again, I'm sure there's much more to say. This is what we're trying to do, to be a uniting force in the world and to push forward the dialogue on these critical principles, while ensuring that what we're doing, and while there may not be other large treaties on things like space resources, et cetera, that when we move forward and when our partners move forward with Artemis, we do so in peace, and we do so honoring all of our obligations to existing multilateral agreements. The journey is to the moon and Mars, but the destination of the Accords is a peaceful and prosperous future. So with that, thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to the discussion, and back to you, Dan.
Once again, sir, that was excellent, and it gives me so much pleasure to know that so many folks that I admire and work with, such as yourself and Gabe and Steve Romina, have put so much love and enthusiasm into these Accords. And of course, as being somebody who has studied under y'all, I also know that we also have to look at things and be critical, and that's why I'm so glad that y'all are having this engagement with a lot of countries. I think it's very important to have as much buy-in into this kind of an effort, because it really is something that's being done for humankind. We're stepping out of our usual bubble and doing something really unique and exciting.
And by the way, I just want to note, it wasn't just Steve and I and Gabriel, et cetera, that everyone who participates in the international dialogue at UN COPUOS, at groups like The Hague, at conversations like this, yourself, Daniel, and Chris and Guoyo, and everyone who has been a part of that dialogue helped us build the Accords. Like, it's really owned by the international family, and all of these discussions helped inform the text of it. So I hope it's a child of all of us that we can all be proud of.
like I said, I'm NASA fan #1 right here. We've all got tons of questions, and I know that a lot of folks really they've been sending us in a lot of different comments and questions. But I'd like to just go ahead and get into it with our experts, because some of them have stayed up quite late, you know, for the privilege of getting to chat with you. But I think I'm going to start with Andre first. So folks, let me introduce you to a good friend of mine. Mr. Andre Riepel is a diplomat from the mission to Brazil to international, it's a mission from Brazil to international organizations in Vienna. He has been representing his country at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space for a while now, and he was even the chair of the 62nd session of COPIOS. So it was last year, or like just finishing up your term. I must add that Andre is here today in his personal capacity, but Andre, as a Brazilian, you know, we've just gotten the news that Brazil has been offered to sign the Artemis Accords as well. That's really exciting, especially coming from a country that is still an emerging space actor. So, sir, what do you think about all this, and what's your perspective?
Well, thank you, Daniel, for the kind words, and thank you, Mike, especially, I mean, not only, of course, telling us what's in the Accords, because we can read that, but sharing with us your enthusiasm. I think this is excellent. To see how much, well, I think I can say love goes into this. So I believe this is a sign of the high expectations that we all have. And yes, I'm very glad to see that my own country has been invited to join. And from what I heard, I think, you know, things should move forward fairly quickly. And soon Brazil will be, I think, what is it, the 10th member? Is that right? Well,
Ninth member.
Well, thank you for correcting me on that. Well,
Top
as Daniel pointed out, I was a chair of COPIOS for the 62nd session, which almost got to be known as the never-ending session, because we had some problems to figure out what to do with the pandemic, you know, but just last week I was able to pass this on to my colleague from Romania. And then, of course, I've been working with many delegations here in Vienna, and what I would like to do is basically to share with you the different comments I hear and the different concerns. And I think that's useful, or I hope rather that that's useful, because it helps us understand even the perceptions and misperceptions that people may have. And I think I can say from the outset that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. Because what I think the agreement, or rather the accords, will be met with is a mix of enthusiasm and excitement, but also concern and even fear sometimes. Because people, you know, when they're navigating into terra incognita, it's only natural that they should say, "Oh, come on, what are these guys doing? What am I being invited to do here, or how is this going to be used?" Because one thing is what diplomats or scientists and specialists do, and then the other thing is what governments do when geopolitics comes into play. Because then, of course, you get a number of different factors that start to be, you know, measured against this, and say, okay, what is their actual intent? And people start seeing things that are not there in the text. So first, I think I should mention all the positive things. And I think the greatest merit, yesterday when I was looking at it, the impression I had is that this text was written by diplomats, or rather just one diplomat who didn't have to argue with anyone else, you know. So I saw here everything that I would like to see in terms of how it addresses the importance of the multilateral framework, how it addresses cooperation and transparency, and the need to find ways to address any kind of well, if you will, you can call it conflict, any kind of misunderstanding, any kind of tension that there may be, you know, among those involved. I think this is all great. I mean, you guys have really given it a lot of thought. So, you know, kudos to you. This is not easy. And another thing that I like here very, very much, and I think that's very important when we talk about space, is that this is both an aspirational and inspirational document, because it tells participants and countries, okay, what we can look forward to, you know, okay, we'll be engaged into this initiative, and we're really looking into not only into space, which by nature is somehow inspirational. But okay, what are we going to achieve? You know, going to Mars, going to the moon, whatever. But then the questions that I hear a lot, and basically I think, you know, what surprised me was that I didn't hear that, let's call it, from the usual suspects in terms of geopolitical interest, but even traditional allies. And the major concerns say, okay, what impact will this have on the multilateral discussions we have at COPUS, in the multilateral system? If we are addressing that, which is fine, and we think the initiative is fine, people say, but shouldn't we be discussing some of these elements here, all the countries, all member states together, and shouldn't we be working on agreed definitions? And then I want to borrow something that Mike said, a rose by any other name, which is a beautiful quote. But here in Vienna, we have to agree on what a rose is. However we call it, at least we have to agree on what that means, okay? We can choose different names, but the definition has to be agreed on. So that's one concern. Even, you know, the issue of definitions is particularly important. I'll give you an example. I heard, and some people say, well, this is not even logical. But the thing is, this type of concerns don't have to be logical. They're just concerns. They have to be addressed. The matter of protected sites, okay? Or heritage sites, as some call it. People say, okay, how do you decide who these are? I mean, who says that these are protected sites? I mean, I agree. I think they should be protected because, you know, they're something that remind us of all the work of our predecessors and so on, and that will stay as a kind of monument, if you will, to future generations. But this is the type of thing, I mean, which may sound silly, but is important. But the most pressing issue, I would say, is the matter of utilization of resources. Somehow, there is a concern, and I will not use the word that the concern is warranted or unwarranted. It is just there. It's a fact, so we have to deal with that. Okay, what impact this might have to commercial activities or in terms of utilization of resources? And then what many countries may just say, okay, we do not really have an agreement or a shared view on whether specific activities are allowed under the Outer Space Treaty, even though the Artemis Accords do make a reference that, you know, to the fact that everything will be carried on in compliance with all the 4 treaties that the US recognizes. People actually say, well, but wait a minute, there are some clauses there that are not absolutely clear, crystal clear. They mean different things to different people. So how can we address that? And then they mention, well, we would like to discuss that. So that was one point. What else? The other thing, and that's perhaps an invitation, an approach, because in my view, and based on the experience I had this year as a chair, and then we had to deal with those issues of sustainability and all those things, which were quite sensitive. I think when we approach this from a multilateral perspective, we have to think about, okay, how would our own countries react if this agreement, these accords had been proposed, let's say, by China or by Russia? What kind of concerns would we have? Because I think this helps us see what kind of perceptions we need to overcome, and how we can bridge any misperceptions and bring these people on board. Because one of the things I personally believe in is that we cannot have a successful framework to guide our renewed exploration of the moon and space and beyond if we don't have everybody on board. Even if they are not members of the accords, they have to be on board. They have to say, well, this is something good, this is something fine, this is something we should all be pursuing in some way or another. I mean, we'll do it our way, but we are fine that you guys are doing that because we believe that this is really good for the, you know, the whole of mankind. So this is something I would invite us to look at. I'll stop at this juncture because I think we'll have some more questions, and then I hope we have more time to address these questions and engage in some form of debate. Thank you.
Mike, would you like to respond?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. I chop at the bit, Daniel. And first of all, thank you, Andre, for your leadership of COPUOS, like you mentioned, through some challenging times. COPUOS is so important for the international dialogue, and the Artemis Accords wouldn't exist without it and the Outer Space Treaty. So again, appreciate your leadership. And love is absolutely the right word, that a lot of love, a lot of passion went into the Accords, as you can see, maybe even too much. So you absolutely have hit upon it. Let me say, relative to the question, and I've heard this many times myself, is why aren't we having this conversation at the COPUOS, or shouldn't we be dealing with these issues at a multilateral level? To which I say, yes, absolutely yes. We should be having these conversations at COPUOS. We should be having these conversations at a multilateral level. And there's nothing in the Artemis Accords that prevents, deters, or hinders that. As a matter of fact, the Accords in numerous places reference the importance of having these very conversations at COPUOS, etc. And if you look at what the Accords are, again, we're reinforcing, we're implementing the Outer Space Treaty, that this is nothing, and I hate to say this, there's nothing new or extraordinary in the Accords, that what we're doing is we're operationalizing the Outer Space Treaty. We're trying to take a modest step forward in terms of implementation because we believe in the multilateral process, that we're taking these multilateral obligations that were developed and simply treating them with respect and authority, to say that we believe so much in what was done at COPUOS. We believe so much in what was done with the Outer Space Treaty that we're not going to let you be a part of Artemis unless you actually abide by it. You've all heard me say the old joke that the Outer Space Treaty is so terrific, it's 50 years old, doesn't look a day over 35. But here's the one blemish on the Outer Space Treaty, that there isn't a lot of incentive for compliance. There isn't teeth to the Outer Space Treaty. And what we tried to do with the Accords is, for the first time, at least there's a repercussion if you don't follow. That if you don't take the Outer Space Treaty seriously, we're not going to let you be a part of the Artemis Accords. So again, I just don't understand, and again, I know the knee-jerk reaction, but if you look at the actual text of the Accords, we're trying to spur a multilateral conversation, that we're taking what was handed down on a multilateral basis and implementing it. And we hope that by doing so, we will have a future discussion. And you gave the example of space heritage. There is so much more to be done with space heritage. And I absolutely hope that Simonetta and COPUOS will engage in a dialogue to say, how do we add to this? How do we define that rose, as you said, Andre? Because that's the work of the COPUOS. In the Artemis Accords, and heritage is a good example where maybe it's not explicitly in the Outer Space Treaty, but I think it's a goal, a principle that we all want to live to. We didn't try to define the rose. Why? Because that's a conversation for the COPUOS where we can all come to global agreement. What we want to do is get to the flower shop, not to continue the analogy too much. We want to have that rose conversation, and it's the work of the COPUOS and the Hague and other international forums to help add definition and details to these issues, whether it's space heritage or deconfliction of activities, etc. So again, these were just common ground principles, all based on the Outer Space Treaty, in the hopes of having more robust conversations at COPUOS, not countries doing something separate from the multilateral process. It's countries honoring the multilateral process, which, to get to your question about China and Russia, which were very much in the foreground of our thoughts. That, again, when we were writing the Accords, even for countries that weren't immediately a part of the Artemis program, we didn't want to say or do anything that every signatory to the Outer Space Treaty shouldn't already be able to abide by. And Woyo can tell us how close we came to the mark or not on that, but it was certainly our hope, certainly our intention, that the principles would be so common sense, so broad, that, again, for example, if you're a signatory to the Moon Agreement or not a signatory to the Moon Agreement, that you could get behind the common sense principles of the Accords that are grounded in the Outer Space Treaty. So relative to China, Russia, we would welcome any nation taking any action to also reaffirm and implement, operationalize the aspects of the Outer Space Treaty that we mentioned in the Accords, or any other important aspects to reinforce relative to the Outer Space Treaty. We're not the only ones with a lock on the truth, and the beauty of COPUOS and the system is that other people will have different perspectives, but we all need to come together to rally around the multilateral treaties that we've got and all reaffirm and implement them, operationalize them, and then for all of these additional details, have those conversations in the COPUOS. So it's not Accords or the COPUOS, it's Accords and the COPUOS, because we want more principles from multilateral conversations that we can implement, which is what the Accords already do for the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, etc. So those are my responses, Daniel, and thank you for the opportunity to respond.
I can see Andre is chomping also at the bit to respond, but let me get to our other experts first, because they are staying up really late for this. And I would like to start with Dr. Cassandra Steer, who I think it's probably like 4 o'clock in the morning, almost 5 o'clock in the morning for you. Dr. Steer is a mission specialist with the Australian National University Institute for Space and a lecturer at the ANU College of Law. She's also been a part of the International Law Association on Space Law Committee, as well as an expert for the Woomera Manual, which is, I think it's getting close to being done, which I think many of the folks here know. So with that, Cassandra, lots of great stuff coming out. Australia also has just signed the Accords, and as we heard, is also a signatory of the Moon Agreement. So I know lots of the lawyers are wondering, how does that work? How do those two how do those two instruments and these two signings come together? But what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Daniel, and just thank you also for the invitation to be on this panel and to speak with such exciting and esteemed colleagues from around the world. I feel like a little bit like I'm in mission control with my headset, but that was just necessary for the sound of my computer. I really want to follow on from a lot of Andre's comments that I think, and I'm just going to admit straight up, before the actual text was released, just last week when the Accords were signed, I was quite skeptical. I was very much in the camp of those who really harbored concerns about the process in particular, and about some of the assertions in the text. Having read the text, some of those concerns have been put at bay, and I was really happy to see, for instance, in many of the principles, the final provision saying that experience is going to be used from this process to actually forward the multilateral process, which is what you were saying, Mike. And also, when I've been speaking to colleagues in the space agency, so to people I know who work in the space agency who were involved in those negotiations, their sense really was that it was a very open and receptive negotiation process across the board from all of the countries in the room. So that was really great to hear as well. However, there are still some concerns, and they're very much in line with what Andre has just mentioned. Particularly this notion that, it's all in the ambit of multilateral negotiations. Going back to volume 1 of these panels, Mike, when you said it's bilateral now, but the multilateral will come later. I think what's necessary to understand is the reality of the multipolar world that we're in again, anno 2020. It's a multipolar world again. Particularly, things have been magnified by the course of events in this year, in 2020. But there is also, given events of the past 4 years, a distrust internationally of statements about multilateralism. And it's not just for the current administration. There's been a trend for a few decades of the US becoming less focused on the multilateral process. So in that context, in that geopolitical context, I think we have to understand the concerns that that many raise, that many harbor. And it also comes off the back of what came before the Artemis Accords, which I know didn't come out of NASA, but these are all US legislatory statements or executive statements. So in 2015, the Space Act, when that was the first legislative statement asserting that space mining, the extraction of resources, is not only something that the US interprets as falling under the Outer Space Treaty, but asserting an exclusive right to US individuals, including companies, once they extract resources, to then be able to transport them, sell them. You know, I was one of many who at the time was writing about a concern, well, this doesn't actually fall under the interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. There's no consensus on that. In fact, there was a lot of pushback by international lawyers and space lawyers on that. Not to say that space mining or these kind of activities shouldn't take place, but that what we need is a regime, an international legal regime to regulate those activities. And that currently under the Outer Space Treaty, it's very unclear whether it is in fact lawful, and many of us would say it doesn't fall under the Space Treaty. And so there was a bit of a pushback internationally against that assertion. Obviously, the US can legislate whatever it wants internally, but in terms of interpreting it, its alignment with the Outer Space Treaty. And then, of course, we had the presidential executive order earlier this year in which it was stated that space is not a global commons, also a statement that sparked a lot of reaction around the world. It's not a legal term of art, but there's a political statement behind that, that if we add that to the 2015 Act, and also this statement in that executive order that the US doesn't consider the Moon Agreement to be representative of customary international law. Now, I don't think anyone would say that it's representative of customary international law, and I'm from a signatory state. But the fact that there was really this explicit statement from the executive of the US saying it wants nothing to do with, clearly the idea of the Moon Agreement being we need to set up an international legal regime to regulate these kinds of activities. And so in that context, to then off the back of that have come out with the Artemis Accords, again, you know, I'm very heartened by what's been added to the text, but I think we need to understand that's why people have those concerns, that there is this greater context. You know, why is there not a greater attempt to really see this, to seed this discussion in international multilateral fora, rather than through this bilateral process, which, and it goes to my second point, and, you know, I am focusing on space mining. Again, there's some fantastic things in the Artemis Accords that not only can we all agree on, but I think we can say NASA should be lauded for raising the standard on things like space debris, interoperability, transparency. There's some great things, but where it's problematic, it is quite problematic. So it's precisely what's at issue when we talk about extraction of resources is whether it can be under the auspices of the Outer Space Treaty. And so to make that statement and then to say anyone who wants part in this program has to abide by this interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. So some of the concerns, and again, it might be helpful to understand that prior to the release of the text of the Artemis Accords, the vast majority of webinars and op-eds and discussions going on around the world about the Artemis Accords were raising these concerns and really questioning, is this an attempt on the part of the US, and forgive me for my frankness, but it is, you know, it's my role in my work to speak truth to power and to critique. So is this an attempt of the US to set up a kind of force of, you must agree with this interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty, to kind of force a new opinion or juris? Because we don't have state practice, we don't have these activities yet, it's contentious, and so if you, and you've even stated yourself that you hope that some aspects of these agreements will be adapted in this way, that there will be, you know, a kind of enlarged international agreement as to what these principles are and what they mean. So that is one of the biggest concerns. Is this a way to force agreements in such a way that later on we could point back and say, well, look, there's opinio juris. Well, look, everyone agrees on this interpretation, when in fact, it's a requirement of buy-in into the program, which is interesting, particularly from the position of Australia, because we are in the unique position of being one of the 18 signatories to the Moon Agreement. When I spoke to the people I know in the Australian Space Agency, they said they found the negotiation process very open. They were able to actually contribute to expanding the wording of and ensuring that multilateral agreements or the reference to multilateral processes are in there. And I would say this is a little bit of the fault of, or the lack of whole of government approach in Australia. Our space agency is very new. Generally, I would say there's a lack of space literacy across different government departments in Australia. And so while the stance right now is, well, we've simply read the Artemis Accords to be in harmony with our obligations under the Moon Agreement. There has been some tension between our Office of International Law and our space agency on that, and it's still really to be teased out, well, how are we going to fulfill our obligation? You know, it looks like we are nearly at such a time that this technology is possible. Article 11.5 would then obligate us to set up an international regime. And so we need to figure out, Australia needs to figure out what it's going to do about that. So one final comment, if I could, about the process and why that's also, I think, problematic for many, particularly those who are not likely to be invited in the immediate future, or those who haven't been involved in the process, is that it appears to be a pre-selection of whose voices get to be involved in determining the nitty-gritty of, well, they are principals, some of them are a bit, get into the nitty-gritty. Anyone who is invited now, who's invited to join as of now, will have to agree with the text as it has been negotiated, right? So Brazil has now been invited. It's fantastic. It's exciting, but they now have to agree what was negotiated. I'm not sure if they were in the room, but the same goes for more countries in the future, which goes against, that's one of the success stories of the Outer Space Treaty, is that could have been an agreement, a bilateral agreement, just between the Soviets and the US, given it was the height of the Cold War. They were the two actors in space. But they saw, and other countries saw, the necessity of involving other states in determining the content of the Outer Space Treaty. So the process is important. And this is one of the reasons why the International Code of Conduct failed, was because a lot of states pushed back and said, even once the meeting was at the UN, we don't agree with this process. Our voices haven't been heard. It got stalled because of that. So process is extremely important. The one final thing I would love to say about a positive note is that, you know, this is important because of Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that these activities are for the benefit of all humankind. Well, it says the province of all mankind. But language matters, right? And I'm really happy to see that there is non-gendered language in the Artemis Accords talking about humanity and humankind and human activity. NASA's been great at that for a couple of decades now. But that matters because we're talking about inclusivity, right? It's the province of all humankind, all states, even those who are not yet involved or may not even be involved in the Artemis Accords.
So Daniel, if I can respond to those very insightful comments, I appreciate you noting that. We wanted to be inclusive not only in goal, but in language. And while I compliment the Outer Space Treaty, that's a wart that is on the Outer Space Treaty and should be amended. That language is wrong as we move forward to the moon and putting the first woman on the moon. I'm so proud of the diversity, particularly of our astronaut corps, that I believe we've got the most diverse astronaut corps that we've ever had at NASA. And that's a big difference between Artemis and Apollo, that there's such a diversity, not only of people, but of organizations involving the private sector and of countries, of bringing the international countries in. But if I can respond to a few things there, and thank you, because I think what you raise is so important, perception versus reality. That going back to some of the other actions relative to the executive order or commercial purchase, et cetera, and, you know, like you say, comments about the administration, et cetera, there was a narrative that was growing up around the Accords that I think was inaccurate. And it was so frustrating for me and the others who have been working on the Accords to hear these criticisms that could not have been more off base relative to the text of the Accords and what we're trying to accomplish. And I appreciated, and Guoyo among them, by the way, you know, folks who took a little bit more nuanced of an approach and recognized that we're not done yet. You haven't seen the text, because again, I'm certainly open to criticism for what we've done, but not what people think we're going to do. And particularly as we look at, you know, the multilateral process again, as you see in the Accords, I could just say that we're taking the multilateral process seriously. We're very engaged with COPUOS. Look forward to working with your own citizen from Australia, Steve Freeland, you know, who's helping to work on the space resources section. We're going to engage in a robust fashion with COPUOS on this topic. And then, as you mentioned, not only are we going to do that, but the Accords themselves reference the importance of the multilateral discussions and of our ability to take our experiences to COPUOS and elsewhere to inform those dialogues. So the Accords, and again, I keep saying this, but forgive me, I don't know how we can read this without recognizing that this is a homage to multilateralism and the Outer Space Treaty, that this is implementing it. Again, we would welcome every country saying that we're taking the Outer Space Treaty seriously. These are the principles we're living by. I want to address also before of the U.S. attempting to force countries with Artemis into the Artemis Accords or into the Artemis program. And again, it's perception versus reality. That was a comment that you heard. And then as you stated, for anyone who was in those negotiations, they have said nothing but this was a completely open process where, again, we were trying to establish common ground. That if the U.S. was trying to force its will or its own positions on other countries, the Accords, of course, would have looked very different. That you point out what was in the executive order relative to global commons, et cetera. That is the U.S. position, right? That was in the executive order. But nowhere in the Accords or in the negotiations did you see us saying, you other countries need to adopt the U.S. position. What is it that we can all agree upon? What's that common ground? Unite rather than divide. And particularly as we get to the is that you can extract and you can utilize. That I think we all extract and utilize resources. And again, there may be an argument there, but at least the countries that signed the Accords and ourselves, I think all agree that, and even for the Moon Agreement nations like Australia, I also don't see any conflict there between the Moon Agreement and what's stated in the Accords in terms of legal principle, that the Moon Agreement anticipates the extraction and utilization of resources. Now, where there would be differences is relative to what the regulatory regime should look like and what a sharing regime might look like for those resources. And we couldn't establish common ground around those topics, which is why that's not dealt with in the Accords. What the Accords say is that what we agree is you can extract, you can utilize, always play within the bounds of the Outer Space Treaty. And those issues that are raised in the Moon Agreement or that you raise relative to a new regulatory authority, those are conversations that we'll have at COPUOS and elsewhere. But the Accords were meant to be that common ground, that threshold, issue. And we look forward to having those conversations, with other nations and to inform that experience. Same with space heritage, right? I mean, you could really go down the principles of the Accords and say this is true in every area, that we weren't trying to force anyone into respecting space heritage. And we absolutely acknowledge that all of these, or at least the vast majority, are issues where we need to get together on a multilateral basis and make a decision. We're just trying to, again, respect the principle. And that's why we weren't prescriptive. We could have gone into great detail, but we recognized we wanted to have that conversation with others because on many of these topics, debris being a good one or resources, you need a global discussion and buy-in. So we were just trying to find out what is it we can all agree to in terms of taking the multilateral agreements that exist, operationalizing them to an extent so that when we do go forward to the moon, we go not only with our astronauts, but with the multilateral principles of the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, the Rescue on Astronauts. And then we will proactively engage with the COPUOS and with others to resolve these matters. And then finally, I want to address the invitation to participate in the negotiations. So again, we need to not make, in a way, more of this than there is. That, and again, I'll get a little bit, I'm a government procurement attorney at heart, right? So forgive me for this. We have something called the Federal Acquisition Regulations in the US. And it's got, see, even Australia, you're familiar with it, flow down clauses, right? You got flow down clauses. What the Artemis Accords in many ways are is the flow down clause for the Outer Space Treaty to the US Artemis participants and international participants. That this is just a way to take the Outer Space Treaty and implement it for Artemis. And that's why we had the group that we had when we negotiated. And yes, in an ideal world, we would sit down with every country that could possibly ever participate in Artemis and say, all right, this is what the Accords are going to look like. And we will try and do that at the COPUOS. but we also cannot wait for every single issue, to ultimately be resolved before going forward to the moon. What we could do is take the multilateral agreements that exist and ensure that the partners that are with us at that very moment, hey, let's all sit down and say, what are these far flow down clause language, right? We want to abide by the Outer Space Treaty. We want to agree by it. And that's the common ground, again, far flow down clauses, if I can call them that we were trying to get with the countries that we had at the time. There certainly could be other iterations to the Accords, edits to come. This is a beginning, not an ending. So I don't want to preclude that other countries may raise issues, and ultimately will. There will be changes to the Accords in the future. I don't know what those changes are, but I will predict with 100% certainty that we'll need changes. But for now, we think that this is a very good common sense, common ground set of principles. And so we'll begin for other countries as they come into the Artemis program to ask them again to agree to abide by the Outer Space Treaty and these common sense principles. And when we say invited, yes, we are having conversations with Brazil. It's a critical partner to the US, a terrific heritage in space, and we look forward to working with Andre and his colleagues. But every country should feel free to contact us and say that they want to participate in Artemis and want to contribute to the Accords. That in no way is this, the US going out and issuing, well, you get an invitation or you get an invitation. We hope the whole world will reach out and say, hey, let's work together on this. And then we will have a dialogue. So, I just wanted to be clear in terms of the nations that are coming on board. It was, again, based on those that we're already working with. It's already public that we've got a pressurized rover with Japan that we're working to utilize with the Artemis program. Australia, I can't say too much more, but had already reached out to us, have been very public relative to participating in Artemis. And that's how we got the countries that we were. So again, it's us trying to honor the multilateral commitments by saying to the countries that were already part of the Artemis program or had expressed a strong interest in doing so, that we want you to abide by the Outer Space Treaty. And this was our effort to operationalize, to include the Outer Space Treaty in our international agreements.
Mike, I'm really glad that it's you who is doing a lot of this outreach for NASA. You have a lot of patience, and I know it must be tough, like meeting up with a bunch of lawyers who are just hammering away at all this beautiful work you're doing. But this is how it gets refined.
I've been on the other side. I appreciate the opportunity. I would have the same questions. And again, I'm on the inside, so I get to see all of this, and I understand how this might look from the outside, which is why I'm spending so much time trying to explain and show, like, it was great for Cassandra to be able to raise that she heard from Australia and the other nations how open we were in the negotiations. That this was not the U.S. trying to force anything. It was the U.S. trying to find common ground with everyone in terms of what's acceptable to all of us. So I appreciate having this opportunity to explain what we've been doing. I was talking with one hand tied behind my back, though, before the text. And now at least you can see.
That's absolutely true. So with that, let me please unleash our final guest, who is also staying up quite late, coming back for round two, the tender panda himself, Dr. Guoyo Wang.
Back by popular demand, Guoyo.
Back by popular demand. He doesn't actually need an introduction, I know, but I'll just go ahead and read some of the highlights real quick. Dr. Guoyo Wang did serve on the Chinese delegation to UN COPIOS for several years. He's been very active in things like the development of the long-term sustainability guidelines and putting input into a lot of the development of other UN frameworks, whether or not they've actually come to fruition yet. He's also an editorial member of the McGill Manual, the Malamos Manual, and he also participated in the Hague Working Group on space resources. Now, Guoyo, you were with us last time. You had a great conversation with Mike and with Gabriel, and it sounds like they heard you on some things. Sorry, it's my puppy Cooper, Gordo Cooper. Yes, I named him after a Mercury astronaut. But Guoyo, you've finally seen the text. You've gotten to see the announcement of some of the countries that have signed on. What do you think so far, sir?
So first, thank you so much for the introduction. And just like Andre, I also speak on my own capacities, always actually. And I thank Mike for the introduction to the Accord again. And I very thankful for your very kind words about me. Actually, it just made me a little bit nervous, considering the tensions between the United States and China. Because some people in China might say, you see, hi, that's the guy who just, be of some contribution to develop, the Accord. I'm kidding, just of course. I'm very happy.
I'm sorry, Guoyo. I can condemn you if need be. So sorry.
Keep going. No, I don't mind. So I'm very
seriously, Guoyo, I do want to say you were so helpful in The Hague, and
okay.
a lot of terrific stuff that you've put forward in the international community. So thank you. Sorry.
Hopefully it's good to me. Okay. I'm very happy and honored to see there are some changes, have been made relevant to my recommendations. But of course, I'm not trying to attribute, all the developments to myself. Of course, or most likely, I should not be the only one, who just gave the similar suggestions. I mean, regarding we say the formula of peaceful purposes or the non-harmful interference, safety zone, or emergency assistance, etc. And I have to say, congratulations, to the president on the new test. As you said, the whole test of the Accord, more details and elegant, even creative ideas are shared with us. But again, I have to say, I'm just follow your instruction. I'm trying to give more contributions to the development of the Accord, and I read the test carefully, and actually I prepared 23 comments or questions, for your further consideration. I hope not now. I know I have to follow the order of our commander, Daniel. So at this stage, I would like to just ask two questions, okay, from a purely legal perspective. The first one, supposing China shows its interest to participate in the project, in the Accords, what do you see the possibility for the Congress to approve it? I'm just kidding, unless you would like to answer it seriously. Okay, just the first question actually is about the legal character of the Accords. In the whole test, it mentioned that Article 102 of the Charter, and it just identifies itself which is not eligible, right, for registration under Article 102. So it means that it's not a treaty, of course, it's not a treaty, it's not an international agreement either. Then what would be the legal character of the Accords? And also it mentioned that United States will maintain the original text of these Accords. It's just only refers to the whole text, or with the signatures of the 8 states. Because if you're just supposed to have the signatures of all the participants, if it's not an agreement, then what will it be? So that's the first question. And the second one is about seriously, it's about the applicability of the Accords to private entities. So it seemingly, the Accords seemingly does not, or only applies to space agencies and the private entities who just who's acting on behalf of certain states. So then, how about in the situation that a private company just acts independently? So that's the second one. Yeah, let's just stop here. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah,
those are
easy ones, right?
Oh,
if you would like to begin with the Chinese one, will be very
yeah,
appreciated.
come on, easy ones. He started with the hard one. He started with my career-ending one. Then he worked out after I'm fired. So, no, Guoyo, two great questions, actually, and I'm sure the other 21 are equally good. And again, really appreciate it. Relative to your first question, though, and obviously, I can't speak for Congress, but let me say that I'm very eager, at a minimum at UN COPUOS, for us to have these conversations, not only with China, but with all the other countries of the world. That part of the challenge that we've had, and you hear me talk about the misperceptions of the Accords, is because we haven't had COPUOS, and this shows you the importance of that group, that we haven't been able to get together in person and answer questions at COPUOS from yourself and other folks who would participate in the legal subcommittee, and that's been very unfortunate. And that's why I'm grateful for the Court Foundation, Space Law Court Foundation, here for us to have this conversation. But I look forward to having that dialogue, hopefully, when we all get back together again in February. Relative to what are the Accords, and again, how do you follow it? It is a good question. And one we struggled with, by the way, mightily, and that I think our positions even evolved on over time. This was a good example of feedback from the international community in terms of what this should be. And again, it gets to the bifurcated nature of the Accords a little bit, that the principles are political commitments, right? So again, these are guidelines. These are, you take something like interoperability, as I mentioned, that any of these you could take to an extreme, right, that you need to avoid, which is why they're at a high level, they're principles, they're not prescriptive. And really here I was just stealing generously from the Outer Space Treaty. Like, I think the reason the Outer Space Treaty has been so effective is that it's a treaty of principles, it's not prescriptive, it's not detailed, it leaves your country in mind to implement as we see fit. And with the principles of the Accords, we also, while honoring the Outer Space Treaty, wanted to also make it a political commitment that these are, and it was mentioned already, some are even aspirational goals, right, in terms of interoperability and some other areas, debris, et cetera. We're all going to try our best. We're going to strive for the better future. And so the principles are not binding, right, to be clear. It's a political commitment. And it's really all the nations trying to do better and to do well relative to these issues. So, and I might be stealing from your Space Review article where almost a signaling, document to say, hey, this is where we want to head. And also maybe a little bit of a guidepost for COPUOS, in terms of issues that we need to deal with. I mean, obviously we're all talking about space resources, so I don't think there's any fear of us missing that one. But space heritage, be really nice to have a conversation about what is that? How do we define that, and to get some more, particularly at LSC, some more meat on the bones to those sorts of issues. So that's the nature of the principles. Now, the contributions are different. And again, this is like every other NASA program, right? That if you make a contribution to NASA, whether it's Artemis or one of our science programs, that's a binding agreement. Like with Gateway, we have binding MOUs. So the bilateral contribution would be done via a binding bilateral agreement. The higher level principles are done via political commitment. And that's the nature of it, where we try to be, again, with the upper level, honoring the multilateral nature of what we're trying to implement in terms of the Outer Space Treaty as a political commitment, recognizing that we're going to learn a lot as we operationalize on the moon. And then for the actual contribution, because that's dollars and cents, that will be actual binding. Relative to the private sector, again, great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify on this. Both you and I were part of the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group, and the only downside of that is we need a better acronym or a shorter name. I'll just say working group from now on in. And it was so terrific. You'll recall when I was there, I was just representing the private sector, and I really liked having a forum where private sector, again, and the government could sit together. That if I were to look at one fault of UN COPUOS, it's that it inherently wasn't really set up for that you don't have a lot of room necessarily for that kind of robust private sector engagement. Now, Simonetta and everyone's doing a great job accommodating that and moving forward, I think, with the changes that we've seen in the space world due to the private sector. But I really did appreciate the way The Hague did what it did, and then took its experiences and then reported out in COPUOS. To be honest, it's almost the same model with the Accords, that it's the US and the nations that are working on Artemis, and then we will report out to COPUOS, and say kind of what our experiences were, and again, looking at these signaling issues that we need to tackle as a world in a multilateral fashion. Now, that being said, there are aspects of the Accords that we hope are helpful to the private sector, and you've heard me note interoperability is one, that we think for the private sector, the more interoperable systems are, the more peaceful the future looks like, the more we can have business because our systems are compatible. So while none of the Accords create an obligation for the private sector at all, like these are government-to-government political commitments, we do hope that there's a precedent that's being set, and we as space lawyers can appreciate the importance of precedent, that at least we should all strive to be interoperable, and that'll help with the private sector. We think at a threshold level with space resources, again, we know it's not much, but saying you can extract and utilize, like at least that's at a threshold level, something we can agree to. Again, the issues with regulations that we brought up with Cassandra and sharing of resources, that's all TBD, and we didn't resolve that with the Artemis Accords because they were a common ground document. But again, maybe it's something that helps in deconfliction of activities, that I think to the extent that people see that governments are taking avoiding harmful interference seriously and that we're communicating, and again, in no way, shape, or form stay out zones or anything that would harm the interests of say someone that came second or later, et cetera, that we want to make sure this is just about notification and coordination, that we want to avoid problems. Nominally, that's probably helpful to the private sector, just to know that people are taking that aspect of the Outer Space Treaty seriously. But there are aspects of the Accords that should not, in our view, be levied on the private sector. An example would be the public release of scientific data, that obviously a for-profit company, or like in China, you'd have a state-owned company maybe, that they shouldn't, if you're a company, you shouldn't necessarily be obligated to publicly release your scientific data. That's not your role in a corporation. That's for the government to do via taxpayer dollars, et cetera. So there are aspects of the Accords that I think we'd have to be very careful as we look at potential applications to the private sector. But again, it's government to government, not intended to make obligations. The way that we have it in the US is, and again, we're NASA, Department of State, we're dealing with the government issues. It's really up to Department of Commerce, the FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation. Those are the regulators that would have to work with the private sector. So hope those answers two of your excellent questions.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. That was really well done. And wow, we've absolutely eaten up our time. We've just got a few minutes left. I know I've certainly got a lot more questions, but we can discuss mine offline. I think what I'd like to do now is let's just go in reverse order. Guoyu, Cassandra, and then Andre give a 1-minute last statement, and then Mike, we will let you wrap it up. Sir, you've been quite the trooper, just parrying all the punches. But I think this is really useful, especially for the rest of us and for the international community, to get a better sense of what are the Artemis Accords, what are the goals, and what is it not. I think that's also a really important thing that we're trying to get at. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who helped put this thing together. Chris Hearsey and Letitia Zarkin, who's our wonderful producer. Couldn't do it without them. And yeah, Guoyu, please kick it off.
Okay, just 1 minute. Okay, I have to
1 minute. And I will turn off your mic. That's a thing now.
Yeah, I just pick easiest one. Okay. I see people, just including our audience, they concerns a lot about the consistency, of the Accords and the Outer Space Treaty. So again, about the peaceful purposes, of course, the new text just add exclusively for peaceful purposes, which is just the inconsistency with the Outer Space Treaty. Well, again, it uses the words, you see, the cooperative activity under these accords should be exclusively. So you see, it's used the word should, not shall. So does it mean there are some flexibilities there? That's the first one. The second one, just mentioned cooperative activities. So I'm afraid it's just narrowed down, the scope of the activities which are supposed to be, shall exclusively for peaceful purpose, because it's just the strike out, we said independent, not cooperative activities, no matter, carried on by the signatory state or by private sectors. So can I ask your consideration, on that?
Hang on. Let's save it for the end. Save it for the end. We'll just wrap them all up. Thank you, Goyo. Cassandra.
Thank you, Daniel. So it's, I really hear what you're saying, Mike, about, what the Artemis Accords are not versus what they are, and that the intention, it really is to feed this into a multilateral process. And obviously, you're speaking for NASA, and there are other arms of the US government which maybe are not speaking in the same language as you are. So that's one of your challenges, which I don't envy you at all. But I guess, I think what really needs to be heard is that it's not just a matter of impressions that need to be corrected. There really is a concern internationally to have more voices included and to give priority to the multilateral processes that are there. We've seen the Outer Space Institute bring out a letter that's been signed by hundreds of people now around the world, really asking the UN to take a greater lead in making sure that we have a multilateral process. And that was also a kind of reaction to concerns that people had about what is it that this process, that the Artemis Accords process represents. However positive it may aim to be, it does have a certain impact. The UK has recently made a submission to the UN making this a similar statement. So I guess as a kind of final comment is that one really great thing I think could come out of the Artemis Accords in respect of these concerns is that it might push COPUOS to move faster. It might push the international community to say, well, if these concerns are there, we all need to be having these discussions. There's a bit of a gap, there's a bit of a vacuum, for want of a better term. And there's a desire to have these activities taking place in the very, very near future. So how do we work together on that? So in some ways, it may trigger the international community to answer its own concerns. So I would hope to see that happen.
Thanks, Cassandra. Andre?
I hate to have only 1 minute because this is so good, and Cassandra and Wang, well, thank you very much for the points you raised. You mentioned a lot of things. Basically, I think, Mike, I'll be maybe the boring guy that'll be pestering you. Bring this discussion into COPUOS. Okay, maybe you'll never invite me for a drink, but bring the discussion there. And you will hear things you may not like or agree with. And that's part of the game, but we have to do that. We have to deal with these issues, and we cannot, pretend they are not there. And I don't think you're doing that. I think you're very clear about that. You're telling us that. But you also, as Cassandra pointed out, you have to work with other bodies in the government, with other people, other representatives. And this has to be brought into COPUOS, and people and different delegations and member states and observers have to be able to share their points of view so that we can move forward. And move forward in a consistent way. I'll just, I don't know if Gabriel Sweeney is actually listening to us. I'll recall a conversation I had with him years ago when we were talking about space resources. I know it's not exactly Artemis Accords, but it illustrates this thing about the process, why this is so important. And at that time, the US had a position, okay, we do not discuss space resources here at COPUOS because that's premature. And I remember telling him, and later I repeated this to Mike O'Connell when he was here, and then he agreed with me. Well, it might be premature, but the US is at the forefront of these developments. You have, because you're so, let's say, well equipped, better equipped than most countries, you have a chance to influence this process, and influence this process in a constructive way. Why are you basically relinquishing or abdicating from this power that you have, if you will? And now I think with the Artemis Accords, we have something similar, although the approach is different. You've told us that you want, you know, to engage with the international community. So please don't be shy. Work hard domestically to persuade, you know, different bodies in the government, because I think if we can bring this to Copus and from there develop a constructive discussion, and I think we can do that. It will be difficult, but it will be constructive. This will be a win-win for everyone. Thank you.
Mike, you've endured a lot. Please wrap us up.
Yes, thank you, Andre. Not only will I tell you that I will bring the Artemis Accords to the Copus, it's required by the Artemis Accords. If you look at the final section, it requires us to submit the Accords to the UN, where they will make copies for every member of the United Nations and certainly every member of Copus to review. Coming to the UN to have these discussions is literally a requirement of the Accords. So not only can I assure you that I personally will do so, you have Jim Bridenstine's signature that that's what we will do. And just related to a couple of questions, Guoyo, again, very perceptive as always, that and it goes back to one of your other questions about should versus shall. If this was a binding agreement, I could say shall. Because it's non-binding, we have to say should. So it wasn't at all that we're trying to dilute that requirement. It's just an artifact of a binding versus non-binding. But it's a good point. You know, we could maybe use something like commit is another word that you can use in a non-binding context, but just know that's where that word came from. And then to Guoyo's second question, the Accords are for the signatories, so the responsibilities don't transfer to a third party in an international cooperation. So if an Artemis Accords signatory is working with a country that isn't a signatory, the Artemis Accords country is only responsible for its operations. It doesn't have to force a third-party country into abiding by the Accords. I thought we captured that in the text well, because that's actually a question that came up. But if we haven't, we can take a second look there. But that certainly is the intent, and we believe what's in the text. Relative to prioritizing a multilateral conversation and the letter that Cassandra mentions, which I haven't seen, again, we would sign such a letter. The purpose of the Accords is to have this conversation, and to the extent the Accords act as a catalyst to the UN engaging on issues like how do we define space heritage, further conversations on space resources. I have literally had these conversations with Simonetta to say, hey, these are all topics we'd like to engage in aggressively. So I am literally trying to have those conversations. I know the UN will engage. It's COVID that's prevented us from doing a lot of this, but not only would I prioritize those multilateral discussions, again, it's literally in the Accords, that the Accords take what the multilateral process has given us and implement it. And then literally go a step farther to say, and then we'll take our experiences back to the multilateral process to have even further conversations. So I think exactly what you're asking for is in the Accords. So with that, I'll stop and say that I don't view any of these things as punches. I view them as hands being held out in friendship and collegiality with our colleagues, because this is the only way we make progress. So again, obviously I feel passionately about these things, but your feedback is very helpful. And you know, Andre, relative to Copus, again, we will take it to Copus. And if everyone agreed with me at Copus, you know, at that point I would pinch myself, because I'm dreaming that never happens at Copus. So I absolutely understand that people won't like, you know, maybe some of the things that we're doing, but we absolutely will engage. It's literally in the Accords. We're going to send copies out immediately. We look forward to having that conversation. Again, this is a beginning of a dialogue, not an ending.
Thanks, Mike. And I think those are perfect words for us to sign off. I want to thank everybody. This has been a really constructive discussion. Again, really delighted to see that even if we don't necessarily agree on everything, we can still talk about it. And I think we are all at least united by a passion for space. So for all the space law students and everyone who submitted questions, apologies that we couldn't get to it. The debate today was just really good. So maybe we'll try and send some of the questions off so that some of our experts can answer them and provide some guidance and try to publish that later on. But for now, I just want to thank everybody for contributing to this conversation, to shaping the way that space activities and human activities going forward are going to take place. This has been really exciting. And Mike, again, thanks so much for your time. I still want one of those jackets though. All right.
Me too.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody.